covered a lot of different hardware vendors for the X3D launch, for the 7900, 7950 X3D, specifically 7950 X3D, because we're trying to get a baseline, because a lot of them seem like they're kind of weird or off, or they had weird quirks. Apparently even the 7800 X3D has weird quirks if you had a 7950 X3D installed prior to installing it. Yeah, which makes me wonder if I have some weird issues going on with mine. Unrelated, I had a 13900K prior to installing it, because I obviously didn't do a fresh install. Alright, let's take a look at our unboxed. Box very loud.
Our box. Today we are finally able to check out the Zen 4 3D V-Cache CPU that you're actually interested in. The Ryzen 7 7800X3D. And boy, is it fast and extremely power efficient.
Ooh.
But before we get to all the exciting graphs, today's sponsors.
Oh, no.
Afraid.
Oh, stop it.
X3. For whatever reason, AMD decided that it would be a good idea to delay the release of the 7800X3D.
Buy the 7950X3D instead.
7950X3D and 17900X3D, both of which arrived back in February. The 7950X3D was by no means a bad product, but it's a very niche product that doesn't really make sense from a pure gaming standpoint, certainly not in terms of value anyway. With just one of the two CCDs armed with 3D V-Cache, the 16-core 7950X3D is heavily reliant on Windows to address the correct core complex die. That didn't always happen, and it still doesn't. Therefore, to ensure maximum performance, gamers are best off disabling the second CCD in the BIOS.
I disagree with that. Best off using Process Lasso.
7800X3D, but paying $700 US for the privilege. Thankfully, the 7800X3D is now
Process Lasso
here,
to do the same thing.
So rather than paying $700 US for the 16-core version and then turning it into a 7800X3D, you can now buy the 7800X3D
or you can use Process Lasso.
$50 US. So that is a much better situation for interested buyers.
And set it to prefer frequency, so it puts everything on frequency cores.
$450, as that makes it just $50 more than the 7700X.
Like what's happening right here. There's still some weird Windows shit that ends up on Core 0 or on your
it's also
on your first 8 cores. Windows still does weird shit.
Be had for $420,
surprise.
While the more desirable 13900K is up around $580.
You can see what's utilizing specific cores.
Now, for this review, I've had to update all of our already very fresh data, and this is because NVIDIA recently changed the way their GeForce drivers behave by disabling resizable bar in games such as Horizon Zero Dawn, and I believe
I haven't disabled in the BIOS
as well. And this has resulted in big performance gains for Intel CPUs in those games.
Good evening, Steven.
And there are also a few other small performance changes here and there, so I just decided to retest everything, including the AM4 and AM5 processors.
I didn't say that already.
This was a massive undertaking with not a whole lot of time to do it. So, along with the latest GeForce drivers using the RTX 4090, I've also updated all of the board's BIOS revisions, and I've moved the LGA 1700 test system over to the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Elite AX motherboard using DDR5 7200 CL34 memory. As for the AM5 test system, that's still using the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, as that is the fastest memory that will work with all Zen 4 processors. Okay, let's get into the data. Right, so before we jump into the benchmark graphs, here's a look at clock behavior of the 7800X3D in Cinebench R23 all-core workload. Under this load, the CPU sustained an average clock frequency of 4.8 GHz and a peak operating temperature of 84 degrees, which is very cool for a Zen 4 processor. Then, running just the single-core test, we saw a sustained frequency of 5 GHz, that's just 200 MHz over what we saw for the all-core workload, and the peak operating temperature dropped down to 66 degrees, so pretty good results there, though it is only a single-core workload. Okay, so when running the all-core workload in Cinebench R23, the 7800X3D is seen to be 8% slower than the 7700X, and a massive 21% slower than the 13600K, and then 37% slower than the 13700K.
You're not buying this for Cinebench.
In terms of value, this will be a pretty poor offering for productivity, and at this price point,
simulated benchmarks, simulations in general.
The biggest drawback of the 3D V-Cache technology is the fact that the cores typically have to clock lower. The 7950X3D was able to get around this by running the Cinebench R23 single-core workload on the second, higher-clocked non-3D Vcache-enabled CCD, but the 7800X3D doesn't have that luxury. So the single-core score drops to just 1,816 points, which is a 30% boost from the 5800X3D, but 8% slower than the 7700X. Now, despite everything we just saw, in Photoshop 2022, the 7800X3D performs quite well, matching the 7950X3D with a score of 1,481 points, though that meant it was still 5% slower than the 7700X. Now, I suspect that the 7950X3D is using the 3D Vcache-enabled CCD for this workload, which is why the 7800X3D offered a similar level of performance.
Surprise!
Moving on, we have the Blender Open Data benchmark.
The manual threading in the background does not work nearly as well on AMD's. The current X3D chips, guys, are very beta-y, which is why the 7800X3D is kind of like what you want to go with. The reason I bought a 7950X3D is because I'm actually going out of my way to micromanage the shit out of my chip. I'm actually going out of my way to micromanage the shit out of my chip. And, you know, these aren't obviously because they don't really matter. But any sort of processes that actually matter are all micromanaged. Because, as it turns out, it actually matters a lot. Because the AMD driver does not do a really good job. Intel does a much, much, much better between the P and E cores than AMD is doing between cache and frequency. And even between the chips on there, between the cores on the frequency and cache, like it's doing stupid shit. Like my Overwatch will only use 7 out of the 8 cores, and 13900K used 8 cores, and my 5900X used 8 cores. It's doing really dumb stuff. Yeah.
A whopping 44% margin. So again, if you're interested in productivity performance, then the 7800X3, it's just not going to be for you. This is a pure gaming CPU, unless of course your workload does benefit from having the 3D Vcache, which
or you go out of your way to micromanage stuff. I think unless, even then, just setting up everything to run on the frequency cores, and then, which is basically everything else, and the cache cores are reserved purely for your gaming workloads, actually a pretty good strategy. It's a pretty good strategy because it defaults everything to basically what would benefit the most from it, unless it's a specialized case, which is almost always games. I don't know why they made the CCD0, which is your primary CCD or chip, they made it the cache one instead of the opposite way around. You might be able to change this with a BIOS or something, but currently you can't do that. So like if it was primary, because Windows will always put shit onto CPU 0 and 1. Always does that shit with drivers and shit. And you can't, it's very difficult to change that. And even if you do, sometimes it fucks shit up while it's doing it. So it's not really something you want to change around. I don't know why they didn't make the frequency core CPU 0 and the cache core CPU 1 for both the 7950 and 7900. Because that's the way it should be. The cache should be on the secondary chip, which then should be basically reserved for games. It should basically be reserved for games. Unless you have some special use case for it. Which almost will exclusively be games in and of itself. That would be a better scenario, and somehow they did two fucker things here. First is, as I mentioned before, with the ordering, putting aside the beta driver bullshit that's going on right now, and putting aside the beta bullshit, is the cache definitely should be on CCD 1 instead of 0, and or they should just both have cache on them in the first place. In an ideal world, an ideal scenario, Windows will be able to optimally put whatever it needs on frequency or cache and do a really good job. It's not, as can be seen here, it's still not in that case. Even with well-known benchmarks or programs, it's still not in that case. Yeah, and Intel just has like a driver. I think they have like a built-in firmware that actually the CPU itself will delegate the responsibilities to the P or E cores depending on what kind of workload it sees. And AMD doesn't do that. They have basically driver hacks built in with the Windows bullshit with the game bar and trying to mishmash the thread scheduler and core parking together to try and make something work. I mean, it does kind of work, but at the same time, it also kind of fucks the pooch if you have too much going on in your background and it causes the park cores to become active again, for instance, sometimes with the right shit. There's a lot of fuckery that's going on right now, and that's part of the problem. And I can only imagine, in a best case scenario, it would be broken down not just by the process itself, but the threads in the process would be delegated to the frequency or the cache cores, depending on what it benefits the most from. Obviously, that's like next gen. Maybe 8000 series or 9000 series will have this feature, but currently it does not. Which is once again one of the problems with the X3D chips and one of my biggest gripes with them. Why I got a 13900K and then I got an X3D chip because it kept nagging at me. It kept fucking nagging at me, and I didn't want a 7800 X3D because I don't want 8 cores. I want more than 8 cores so I can put everything else onto my other cores. And if it was 8 cache cores and 4 frequency cores, I think it would be even better, but that's not where we're at right now.
3D is really impressive is when it comes to power consumption. The 13600K, for example, it was 11% faster in this benchmark, but for that extra performance, we saw a whopping 52% increase in total system power consumption, and that is total system power consumption. The 13700K
stuff that uses a shitload of power is probably not
faster,
games, so it
but
doesn't
here we
matter.
can see it consumes 89% more power, and that again is total system power. So in terms of efficiency, the 7950X3D is actually amazing here, and the 7800X3D is also great for the levels of performance it delivers. Okay, on to some gaming benchmarks, and quite disappointingly, the 7950X3D is still broken in the Factorio benchmark.
Why?
Now, if you manually disable the section...
because it's operating on the frequency cores instead of the cache cores. Instead of disabling it, you probably could actually just use process lasso and bump them over to the cache cores, so, or use game bar.
CCD, it can match what we're seeing here from the 7800X3D, but failing to do so sees the game run on the second CCD, and performance is drastically reduced. Anyway, this is a good example of the performance-related issues you can avoid with the 7800X3D. So having just a
or with manual tweaking
cache-enabled CCD means the game or program always has access to the larger L3 cache. So in this example, the 7800X3D is 22% faster than the 5800X3D, 55% faster than the 13900K, 72% faster than the 13700K, and 77% faster than the 7700X. Next up, we have Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing enabled, and here the 7800X3D does quite well, edging out the 13900K by a 3% margin, so performance overall is much the same.
So I wonder if the little extra performance in the 7950X3D is coming from the extra cores on it, or if it is the cache cores are slightly faster.
Boost. Meanwhile, the 7950X3D is clocked a little more aggressively, resulting in a minor 3% performance bump over the 7800X3D.
Problem, by the way, is if you have a 7950X3D, is if you have the built-in driver, trying to get it to use more than 8 cores, Windows does not, like, it is built for either CCD 0 or 1. And if you try to use, let's say, 12 cores, yeah, it is a fucking shit show. It's a fucking shit show because the priorities are different due to the CCD CPPC, so the core performance order, and it's going to prioritize whatever you have it set to, right? But if you set for frequency, for instance, as I do, if I try to use the cache cores and the frequency cores, it's going to try, like, I'll add like 4 cores to it from the cache core or from the frequency cores. It's going to try and lump everything onto those frequency cores because they're rated much higher in the CPPC order. I'd have to basically swap it to cache instead, prefer cache, and then manually assign them otherwise in order to properly utilize more than 8 cores and still use my cache cores. There is a lot of issues going on.
As for power consumption...
That being said, if you're trying to use the E-cores with the with the 13,000 series, the game has to be very, very specialized to do that. They are not remotely equal to the performance cores. So if it tries to use more than 8 cores in the case of the 13900K, for instance, the game would have to be very, very, very tailored to use those E-cores properly and not gimp itself with them. In the case of the 7950X3D, it's not necessarily the case, right?
I'm going to show total system usage, as I feel this is more relevant to someone looking at buying this CPU, or any CPU for that matter. These results are heavily influenced by performance, as in how
oh my god, 100 watts! That's insane. Gaming for 4 hours a day, that's like...
Having said all of that though, the 7800X3D was 3% faster than the 1300K in this game, while using 20% less power.
Power measurements don't matter. They matter in mobile, and they matter in...
So that is a big deal when it comes to thermal output and just the general consumption of the computer.
Data centers,
moving on to Spider-Man
where you have a shitload of products, they don't matter for a home user for the most part, unless you really, really care about extra 100 watts in your room.
As the 7950X3D was. Again, the slightly higher clock 7950X3D was able to deliver 4%
plugged into a magical outlet in the wall,
hitting an impressive 164 FPS. Even so, the 7800X3D was 9% faster than the 13900K, and remember, the Core i9 processor has been paired with DDR5 7200 memory, which really helps in this bandwidth-sensitive game. And here's another look at total system power consumption.
7500?
In Spider-Man, the 7800X3D saw total system load hit 339 watts,
Why?
which is a
Who the fuck
28%
has that?
reduction when compared to the 13900K, which is quite incredible given that the AMD processor was 9% faster. Now, I've been asked, which is quite incredible given that the AMD processor was 9% faster. Now, I've been asked by some members of the driving simulator community to change the way that I test ACC, moving away from the medium preset towards epic. So that's what I've done here.
Why?
And this has led to some interesting results which verify what some sim racers have been reporting. Whereas the 13900K and 7950X3D were neck and neck using the medium settings, the more demanding epic settings indeed hand the Zen 4 part a massive 31% win.
Very weird. Very, very weird. By the way, this is why I've suggested before that even though you want to test at a lower resolution, probably should be testing 720p with this. Some settings, very weirdly, some settings on Ultra will actually, this is with PlanetSide 2 has the same issue. Some settings will actually, the higher you set them, the better performance you get. That should not work that way, but in some games it does. It usually means it's utilizing some other technique or something that can either offload to your CPU or GPU appropriately. That's not otherwise using, like, it's kind of like almost like a compatibility switch. Yeah, very weird. And also, as I mentioned before, like if I was to do tech testing, I'd probably 720p and then tech still test, I think 480p or 360p. Not because I think anyone in the world ever plays games at 720p or 360p, but rather because it completely alleviates a GPU bottleneck. It's never going to be an issue. And that's really matters in CPU testing because we can assume in 2 years you're going to have a 5000 series NVIDIA GPU, or even newer sooner than that. You're going to have a 5000 series GPU, right? And it's going to be faster, and that bottleneck's going to be alleviated. So you have to look at a scenario in which CPUs in and of themselves in their own ecosystem will be competitive with each other, right? I'd agree with this. I'd very, very, very much agree with this as long as your epic settings do not run into they don't run into a GPU bottleneck. Utilization should never be like maybe even over 90%. As long as it never runs into a bottleneck, and as long as it's always trying to stay at the highest clock state, I have no problems with this as long as it never hits a bottleneck. And even then, maybe this is hitting a bottleneck here. No idea. Very weird.
Oddly,
and this is something you have to be, and it's probably not even the Epic settings themselves. There's probably one of the options or even a couple of the options in the Epic settings that are doing this. And you'd have to basically go through each one of the settings and figure out which one is actually offloading appropriately and basically increasing FPS, despite the fact that it's it's a more graphically fidelity setting, right? Fucking weird.
though, the 7950X3D
This is where you basically have to look at utilization,
7800X3D,
GPU utilization,
which is a much bigger margin than I was expecting to see, but after triple checking the results, they are accurate. Even so, this meant that the 7800X3D is 18% faster than the 13900K, 21% faster than the 5800X3D, 25% faster than the 13700K.
Wonder why the 7950 is so much faster than the 7800X3D is.
Sadly, I haven't gone back and recorded power usage for this particular game, as this was something I went back and looked at.
Care about power usage.
The games
there must be someone harping about that, which is why he's adding it now.
6 games will have to do for those power figures. And next up, we do have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here the 7800X3D was the fastest CPU tested, pumping out an impressive 330 FPS, making it 6% faster than the 7950X3D and 13.
This must mean it's not utilizing the cache cores properly, or something's going on here. So if the 7950X3D is clocked higher on the cache cores, why is it running slower in this case than the 7800X3D? Like I said, there's a lot of weird fucking issues with the 7900, 7950X3D. I definitely would not buy a 7900X3D at all, which is kind of sad. But that's where we're at right now. Whereas the P and E cores with Intel, you're looking, even in the 12,000 series, they worked relatively well. They still have nuances. I can confirm that because I owned one. I'm probably going to sell it. They still have weird nuances, but it's not as bad as what you're seeing with AMD. This should not be a thing. This should not be a thing right here. Because the cache cores on the 7950 are clocked higher than the 7800X3D. So why is it performing worse in this benchmark?
10% faster than the 13900K. We're also looking at a rather substantial 27% boost over the 7700X. Now, I did measure total system usage for this game, and here the 7800X3D configuration consumes slightly more power than the
Don't
7700X,
care.
a 4% rise, but remember, we did see a
Yeah,
27%
there's someone jerking off in the background about efficiency, I guess. This matters in a laptop. This would matter for gaming on the run. This would matter in a cell phone. This would matter in a data center where you have thousands of these, which they aren't going to have, mind you, because it's a gaming chip. This does not matter in your desktop. It's just this happened to like I'd say 15 years ago. There's in Tech Report they're overemphasizing efficiency numbers, and it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you plug it into the magical goodies creator in the wall, and you get charged for it. And depending on your electricity cost, it's probably going to be next to nothing. Does it matter to some people? Sure. And you could summarize that with at the end with power performance numbers as far as like maybe a simulation benchmark. You don't need to go into each and every game, and I wouldn't do this, but he's doing it. I'd rather see 0.1% numbers. I'd rather see multiplayer games tested. There's a lot of usage, weird, nuanced usage cases as far as like driver stuff that's going, as I mentioned, with Process Lasso, where he says you have to disable a CCD, which is a completely involved process because you have to reboot your computer as opposed to just setting it with Process Lasso to automatically put it onto whatever cores you want, right? That being said, it's another step, but the X3D chips in general seem to have problems with drivers, very beta E software. Even though they perform really well, you have to basically tune it and tweak the dials and turn the knobs to get it to work right.
Increase in performance. So the 3D V-cache part was significantly more efficient. It also consumed 21% less power than the 13900K, despite delivering 13% more performance. So while the 1300K was quite impressive in terms of performance, power efficiency is just horrible. As we found previously in the 7950X3D review, that CPU just kind of sucks in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Extraction, and AMD
Because he
hasn't
probably
been able to address this
didn't
issue.
process lasso
The
them
7800X3D,
to
on the other hand, well, that ran just fine.
zero.
Although performance is really no
The cache
better
cores.
than the 7700X, at least it's not worse, I guess. It was also 9% faster than the 13900K, though I think it is fair to say that every CPU tested here was more than fast enough. The 3D
Fast enough
V-cache
is relative.
Zen 4
I need
CPUs
my
are
FPS
brutally
not at
fast in
1,000
Watch
yet.
Dogs Legion, with the 7800X3D pumping out 211 FPS, making it just 1.5% slower than the 7950X3D, but 15% faster than the 1300K, and then 19% faster than the 13700K and 5800X3D. We're also looking at a 25% boost over the 7700X. Now, Hitman 3, this game doesn't run particularly well on Zen 4 processors, at least relative to Intel's Raptor Lake series. The 7800X3D, for example, was just 4% faster than the 7700X, and that meant it was 11% slower than the 1300K and 8% slower than the 13700K. So not a great result here for AMD's new 3D V-cache part. That said, if we look at power consumption, the 7800X3D still looks pretty good despite the lackluster FPS performance, pushing 21% less than the 7800X3D was still in Horizon Zero Dawn for Intel processors. The 7800X3D was still
Well, it's getting weird that it's faster than the 7950
13900K,
X3D.
delivering 6% more performance in this example.
I
Not
do wonder
exactly a
what
huge
happened with the
difference,
process
but
lasso
previous
scenario.
GeForce drivers did hand AMD a very significant advantage in this game. The 7800X3D was also just 7%
There's a clock
faster
advantage,
than
you
the
just perform better,
7700X,
right?
so 3D V-cache really isn't helping much here. Cyberpunk 2077 has been tested with ray tracing enabled, and here the 7800X3D basically matched the 7950X3D while producing similar numbers to that of the 13900K, though the 1% lows were a bit stronger for the AMD processor.
This looks like it's very, very, very GPU bound, as you can see by the flat scale here. Even though he's basically, well, why does he have ray tracing? What? Why would you have ray tracing on? This is basically a GPU bound scenario. I don't even know why you included this. Yeah, this because of Cyberpunk in general, which is very, very heavy on your GPU. And then there's this. So, yeah. Yeah, there's this. Also, if I remember right, I don't know if the bug's still in the game, but in Cyberpunk, you had to disable... what did you have to do? You had to manually tell the game to use a certain number of cores or affinities or something. There was a core fixer, if I remember right. I don't remember exactly what it did, but it definitely helped with FPS. This was it. This is fixed now, though. If I remember right, you still have to use it, even though it says it's fixed. I did this on my 5900X. It definitely helped. Yeah, you had to use a hex editor, but there's a mod for it. I don't remember exactly what this does. If I remember right, it wasn't using the cores properly or something, or it saw even though I had SMT off, it saw the core order as it having SMT on, even though it didn't. It was using cross cores, or it was doing something really fucking weird, and it's not applicable to like other games.
Still, we are mostly GPU limited in this test, but with a strong call for more RT benchmarks in our CPU reviews, we decided to make some changes here.
Why?
That said, I did still test the game using the medium preset with RT disabled, and while I won't bother showing those results here, I will report that scaling was pretty much the same as what we're looking at. What is interesting are the power consumption results. Despite delivering basically a 4 processors aren't to be said. Like Hitman.
Why would you test ray tracing in a CPU bottleneck? You said, I mean, the scaling is basically the same, which means that there's no real, they're not running into a GPU bottleneck in the first place. I don't know why you'd ever turn ray tracing on in a CPU benchmark in the first place. You're trying to benchmark CPUs, not GPUs here, right?
Hitman 3, the Rift Breaker is a game where Zen 4
Like,
processors aren't
butthurt
particularly
NVIDIA
impressive.
users that are I own a
7800X3D
4090,
managed
mind you.
225 FPS
Butthurt
on average,
NVIDIA users that
making the
want
13700K
their
2%
GPU to perform
faster,
better or aim
which
to
does mean the
tank or
performance
something. I
between
don't
these
know.
two parts was basically identical, but it also means that the 1300K was 8% faster. Again, not horrible margins by any means, but the new 3D V-Cache part was slower here. Another bad title for the new 3D V-Cache processors is Counter-Strike Global Offensive.
You set this to the
Basically,
frequency
game doesn't
cores
require
on
any more
7950X3D and it
L3 cache. The
performs well
standard
though.
processors have more than enough for this game. Rather, the issue
Performs
here is
basically like
CPU frequency.
the
Overclocking the
7950X.
7800X3D slower resulted in a massive
One of the games that actually
19%
doesn't
performance
benefit from
loss
cache and
to the
frequency instead.
7700X. Last up, we have a Plague Tale Requiem, and here the 7800X3D is fine, though I suspect we're again system bottlenecked at around 150 FPS. It was basically able to match the Raptor Lake parts, offering a mild 14% boost over the standard Zen 4 part. In this example, Intel's Core 12 game average. The 7800X3D basically matched the 7950X3D in the end, making it just 3% faster than the 1300K. So while that's technically a win for AMD, I think it is fair to say that overall performance is much the same. The 1300K gains around 5% more performance on average when going from DDR5 6400 to 7200 memory, so if we were to pair the Intel processor with the more affordable DDR5 memory, the 7800X3D would be around 7 to 8% faster. When compared to the 13700K, we're looking at a 6% performance uplift, which is still pretty small overall, and then just an 11% boost over the standard 7700X. Of course, there are examples where the performance uplift was far more substantial, but there are also examples where we saw basically no performance uplift. You might also find this graph interesting. Here's a look at the total system power consumption.
Be very curious
averaged
about
across the
0.1%. We'll see that in
games where we
Gamer
looked at
Nexus
power
though.
usage. I've also included the average frame rate performance.
But that really should
for
be no
the
different. I
6
don't
games that
think
we're
Gamer
looking at.
Nexus
And as
tested
you can see,
a
on
simulated
average,
benchmark though.
the 7800X3D was just
Except
2.5%
no, they didn't.
faster
It was a
than the
frequency
1300K
test in
this dataset.
Counter-Strike.
But the Core i9 processor pushed total system consumption 28% higher. Then when compared to the 7700X, the 7800X3D was on average 13% faster in these games while using about 4% less power. So the 7800X3D isn't just very fast for gaming, it's also extreme processors. And there are a few not including. Okay, time for some cost per frame data, and right off the bat, I'm going to have to highlight the fact that I'm not including the cheaper, but just as effective non-X Ryzen processors. And there are a few reasons for this.
As well as cheaper motherboards. I believe this is CPU custom.
Firstly, adding another 3 processors to the testing would have required time that I simply didn't have. And on top of that, I then have to include the non-K Intel processors. And before you know it, the total number of CPUs tested has quickly doubled. Having said all of that though, if the data was vital to this review, I would have included it. But realistically, most people considering something like the 7800X3D for gaming are after a non-compromised type solution, and therefore will likely only be considering a high-end CPU that offers maximum performance. You can also make your own pricing adjustments.
I would say, well, if we're looking at 7800X3D in the first place, you're already starting to look at like the mid-range CPUs, right? 1300K is technically 550. This is 450. 580 here. I bought mine for 550 though. But if you're looking at that, you're already like, I'd say 450, even though that's a lot of money, is still getting down to like mid-range / low end, and maybe then you'd actually start willing to make compromises on your. I wouldn't say this is the same thing as buying a 3900K or a 7950X3D.
7700, for example, it's about 5% slower than the 7700X. So just reduce the performance.
It doesn't even have
here from
benchmarks for
199
7900X3D.
to, say, 190 FPS.
I mean, I don't
And
blame. I don't think
your
7900X3D is an
pricing.
option for anything at this
Anyway,
point.
comparing with the higher end models, the 7800X3D comes out at a cost per frame of $2.03, placing it alongside the 7700X and 13700K in terms of value.
I'd go with
This also means
7800
that
over
it's
the
25%
137
better
though.
value than the 13900K and 36% better value than the 7950X3D. That said though, we should probably recalculate with the motherboard and memory pricing and
This, I think, is outdated. I think at this point, there's a lot of people that would consider saving an extra $150 on their motherboard if they can, which is why the A620 is going to be a big deal. Yeah, and for Intel, basically, you're going to be around $200. I think mine, I got a semi-nice motherboard, and it's around $200. I think it was $250. I think I got an open box.
included. So a total system cost analysis then. With AM5, you're faced with having to pay at least $260 US for an entry-level X670E motherboard,
if you
while
want
usable
X670,
B650 boards
which you don't
start
need.
at $140. But since I want to compare high-end platforms, and Intel Z690 and Z790 pricing is much the same at around $200.
But the lower end Intel, once again, you're going to start running into micro ATX, and I don't want to say cutting off features. I guess I really emphasize PCIe ports, and having 2 or 3 at the bottom of the board is actually really important to me. And micro ATX doesn't have that, especially if you put a giant heatsink over the top.
I thought it was only fair to evaluate the cost per
I guess it's going to really. I don't think there are any B650 boards that are
so for
around
AM5,
140 that are
using
ATX.
The $260 US ASRock X670 EPG Lightning, which I know to be a good motherboard. And then, of
Maybe
course, we're
comparable.
factoring in the price of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, which comes out at $140 right now. Then for Intel, there are multiple Z690 and Z790 motherboards available for $200 US.
Most of the low-end
while the
B650 or
7200 memory that we use to achieve these results costs
X670 boards are
and this means
garbage
you could
for
save
some
around
reason.
$60 on the Intel
Usually they
build
have
by
shit
opting for
VRMs or
DDR5
something.
6400, but performance will be reduced by around 5%. Also, you can save
Gigabyte board. Oh, that's
US
Intel.
on the AMD AM5.
I had a really
build
nice
by going
$200
to the
Gigabyte board, and it
B650
had
board,
absolutely
but you'll be
terrible
dropping
coil
a
line.
large
Never
number of
again.
features by doing so. So with those values all punched into our graph, this is what we find. The 7800X 3D combo comes out to a cost of $3.84, making it one of the best value high-end combos, or rather the best value high-end combo. It's a few percent cheaper than the 13700K, and it's 17% cheaper than the 13900K, saving you around $135 US. So there you have it. The Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is one of the fastest gaming CPUs on the market right now. It's also the most power efficient while offering a high level of value at $450 US. There are certainly better value deals out there, such as the Ryzen 7 7700 Non-X or even the 7600, but they're also slower. So when it comes to sort of top tier gaming performance, the value of the 7800X 3D just can't be beaten right now.
Say it's like mid-range, mid-high.
On the absolute cheapest AM5 motherboard you can find. We're talking around $100 here.
A620,
and
guys.
The 7800X 3D will still perform as shown in this review. And that's not something you can say about the Core i9 1300K, which is a MOSFET imploder on low-end boards. Well, that's not necessarily true. You're just heavily power limited, which will degrade performance. And don't get me wrong, the 13900K is still a mighty impressive processor and a terrific gaming CPU, but it's not without its flaws. The need for expensive DDR5 memory to roughly match the 7800X 3D does hurt its value, though it has to be said it will still get reasonably close to much cheaper memory. So as I see it, the real issue here is power consumption and of course platform longevity. Those total system power figures when gaming were quite shocking, and they explain why the 13900K still manages to run so hot in demanding games. It just sucks down a tremendous amount of power for a CPU. When it comes to productivity though, the 13900K is simply in a different league, as is the 13700K. Though I should note both are extremely power hungry for all-core productivity workloads, and they really do need to be power limited. And at that point, I think you're better served by the 7950X or 7950X 3D, which typically deliver a similar level of performance to that of a non-power limited i7 or i9, while reducing total system usage by half, which is a staggering difference. And then there's platform support. Spending $200 on an LGA 1700 board
slots, guys.
1300K means your next CPU upgrade will require.
Is that the Gigabyte board that I had?
And this won't necessarily be the case with a $260 AM5
I have the UDAC.
board,
I think that's just
and
the
this
UDA.
goes a long way in helping you swallow that price premium. I still don't like it. I think AM5 boards are far too expensive, especially those X670 boards. But the fact that a Zen 5 CPU will be a viable upgrade on the same board should end up being a seriously big deal. But I guess we'll find out next year. And then support beyond that, not entirely sure, but I think we will get another CPU series on that board. But of course, we'll just have to wait and see what AMD does there. At the end of the day, though, I think it is quite clear to say that arguing about which is the fastest gaming CPU is just a complete waste of time. These new Zen 4 3D V-Cache parts or the Core i9 1300K, it very much is a waste of time. The definition of time wasting, in my opinion. They're just both very fast CPUs, and there's no chance any gamer will be able to tell them apart when actually gaming.
I don't know. They feel different. I have a 1300K and a 7950X 3D, and they feel different.
In short, the Ryzen 7
and it's not the extra 60 FPS I'm getting in Overwatch, bringing me from 530 to
blown away. It's not
580 on
miles
average.
more powerful
That's
than
not it.
processors we already had. But I guess if anything's blown me away, it's how power efficient this thing is. But how much gamers actually care about that, kind of hard to say. I guess that's something that we'll poll with the audience after these reviews go live.
But
just to get a bit of a
he
feel
seems
for
excited about it, but I get it. Differences are exciting when you're a benchmarker. In this case, the difference doesn't fucking matter. It has it. If this is a mobile, if he was testing on laptops and he's looking at this, yes, it would. It would matter a lot. If we're looking at the box I have on my desk where I take a cord and plug it into the wall and then I get a bill at the end of the month, doesn't matter. But maybe if someone lives in a tiny little room and that extra 100 watts is going to cook them, maybe then it matters. For me, it doesn't matter. But to each their own. As I mentioned, this happened 15 years ago, and I was arguing exactly the same points I am now, which is it doesn't matter to your average gamer. It matters on your phone. It matters on your laptop. It matters in works and data centers. But for me, as a gamer, no, that doesn't matter at all. I don't care if the 1300K sips an extra 400 watts. It really doesn't matter to me. 400, I mean, would be pretty excessive, but it's that 100 watts.
I will end this review. If you enjoyed it, give it one of those. Subscribe for more. We're going to have heaps of benchmarks coming up with this CPU. Probably do like a 30-plus game benchmark comparing it with maybe the 5800X3D, various Intel CPUs. Heap of content coming up around this processor. So yeah, make sure you subscribe for that. Also, if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, you can sign up to Floatplane or Patreon. Either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server for members only, monthly live stream with Tim and myself. We can ask us questions live. We'll answer those. Q&A series where we do much of the same but not live, and behind the scenes content. So,
as you would expect, we're going to take a look at gamers next. We're probably going to fast forward through it since we got the nitty gritty. I am curious about the 0.1% benchmarks, which Gamers Next does test, where Hardware Unboxed does not.
The biggest thing that the 7800X3D does is make the 7900X3D look like trash. Which actually should be the opening line for this video. So
as I mentioned, I don't know what they did with the 7900X3D. No. I mean, if they're making special cache cores with only six pieces of cache on them, maybe they should have made 2. Yeah. No.
Today we're reviewing AMD's new Ryzen 7 7800X3D CPU. This is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU. It's $450, and it comes with the AMD's 3DV cache. But it's a single CCD. That's the core part in all of the specs because, oh, it's the core part. That wasn't intentional. It's the main part of importance, though, for this because the 7950X3D and the 7900X3D both had a core parking conundrum where you effectively turn off half the cores in order to play games, and it works okay.
Or you lasso them.
This doesn't need to do that. So,
but that's an extra step the end user should not need to go through. So,
the 5800X3D from AMD previously, that's still a fierce fighter right now, and we're going to be looking at both of those along with the other over a dozen CPUs on our chart. And we're excited for this review specifically because we're adding a lot of depth in this. So we always collect frame time data. That's how we build our frame rate charts. But this time we're going to present a couple more frame time charts to give you a more empirical look at the gaming
more games or just more charts?
Between the 7800X3D and the 13700K.
They're probably going to do frame time graphs.
And the box is on the
which is what Tech Report did years ago.
So we're clear on that. But let's get started. This video is brought to you by us. Flux, tinning and material trays for phone screens and heat sinks. Screwdriver holders, Gamers Next 40p charts more than usual. We typically don't include them, but we collect the numbers. And then we also have, in addition to the frame time data, individually broken out for the 13700K comparison, we've brought in some really good showcases of terrible data that is easy to run into with this CPU if you're using a contaminated OS. We'll show that. And
they're talking about the driver bug.
Efficiency, gaming, and
contaminated.
So,
you upgraded or side graded.
The 7950X and the 7900X3D have already launched.
It's now contaminated.
About a month before
what the
this,
fuck is
both of
Your
them
OS is toxic because you decided to upgrade your hardware.
And the core parking issue in detail in the 7950X3D review. So we'll leave that there for you if you want to learn about it if you don't know. The 7000X3D CPUs stack the V-cache on only one CCD. So AMD composition for Ryzen CPU 7000 series right now is going to be a maximum of 3 chiplets, where you have one is the I/O die, doesn't count, just ignore it. One is the primary CCD, one is the secondary, where secondary isn't always there, and primary is the one that gets the V cache. On the previous X3D CPUs, you would have to park half of the cores or not use them in gaming, because otherwise you end up having to cross the interconnect or the infinity fabric to go from the secondary CCD to the primary CCD if there is a cache hit on that V cache that's stacked. The added latency was worse for performance than just restraining all gaming traffic to a single CCD.
I think that depends on the game.
X3D comes in. It resolves the issue.
There aren't many games that use more than 8 cores, though.
Layout. And the reason for that is because the 7900 X3D, when you park the cores, so you're not using that second CCD and potentially hindering performance with latency hits, you're cutting it down to a 6-core CPU, effectively, for gaming, whereas this is 8, and it's still single CCD. So don't be surprised when the 78X3D outperforms 79. Only in scenarios where the frequency is more beneficial will it really be more of a toss-up or allow the 79 to claw back some of that loss, because AMD,
if the core scheduler is very smart, it could take advantage of both CCDs, but it's not.
So compete too hard
maybe 2 series from now, 4 years from now, 2 years from now, we'll see that.
Hard to just 5 gigahertz as the up to max boost number. That's a big transition between OS. For the 7950 X3D, and half of the cores are parked. They're doing nothing. And that's during gaming. That's a good thing, because its performance tanks from cross CCD V cache hits otherwise. We talked about this in the last one. And here's the 7800 X3D version of that chart. This is bad data, though. This chart is on the same OS we used for the 7950 X3D, but with a full manual wipe of the chipset drivers and with installation of new drivers from scratch. Even with all of that careful removal and swapping of the...
So, a couple different things have popped up. They're not the only ones that ran into this, mind you. And there's some people who say, oh, you should always do a clean install. That's not the point. You know how many fucking end users are going to do a clean install? Almost none of them are going to do a clean install. Let's be perfectly honest. And if they didn't actually run into this bug in the first place by trying to swap the chips, not intentionally, mind you, they didn't run into this in the first place, how many people would even know this fucking exists? AMD doesn't know this exists, which is why the bug exists in the first place. So, yeah, people are like, oh, you should just test a clean install. Well, sure, of course, in an ideal world, it'd be great, but that's not where end users live. Just like I firmly believe that they should test a partially bloated OS install with other things running on it, because end users don't have just a game and a stripped down Windows install running. That's not how they play. And I understand it shouldn't be the only benchmark, but it should be one of the benchmarks that people are using. And no one does that. No one tests a partially bloated Windows install. Because I have 5 million things open. I buy a 16-core chip. I'm not buying a 16-core chip because I'm going to only use 8 of the cores. You know, okay, yeah, makes perfect sense. Like, that's not the reason I'm doing that. Mind you, this doesn't even work when C-states are on. I have C-states off right now. Unrelated. But yeah, it's fucking weird. But anyways, multiple hardware reviewers ran into this. Tom's Hardware ran into this. Tech Power Up ran into this as well. Yeah, and apparently AMD responded and said some of the changes that the driver makes can't actually be undone. What? AMD is changing parts of your OS that can't be reverted. What the fuck is that? How does that even happen? And why does that happen? Really fucking weird. I didn't install the PPT driver, and I'm glad I didn't, because it seems as though even if you disable it, it's not the same thing as just not having it installed in the first place. PPT driver is a file provisioning driver. It's so you can, I think it's PPT. It's the one that basically tells cores to park. And I shouldn't have any core parking ever, because that's not how I want to run my computer. I want to manually assign stuff to different cores. And once again, this right here that's running, no idea what's doing it. But it should be preferring my frequency cores, and a lot of stuff is manually lassoed to these 8 cores. But as you can see here, there's still stuff running. Probably driver level stuff is running on my cores right now, as you can see.
The chipset drivers, the OS remained contaminated by AMD's core parking add-ons that are meant for the higher-end X3D CPUs. And so half of the cores on the 7800 X3D were parked as well. That's bad because of the single CCD stuff.
And there's no way of actually breaking down utilization based on cores. You should be able to do that nowadays, and you can't.
We installed a new OS. This resolves the problem completely and means that there are no more driver gremlins left behind. So we're all good for our data, but we wanted to show you what it'll look like if you end up upgrading or something like that in the future. Let's look at frequency. Frequency is important to understand on this part because AMD is tweaking the frequency so far down on the 7800X3D, it's possible that it actually underperforms versus a 7700X in scenarios where the Vcache isn't helpful. This plot shows a sustained all-core workload. The 7800X3D ran at about 4850 megahertz when averaging all cores. This is significantly lower than we're used to seeing on Zen 4 parts and explains some of the upcoming disparities. Adding the 7700X to the chart, we see an average of 5180 to 5200 megahertz all core. It's a substantial uplift, and that'll benefit it heavily in anything that favors frequency to cache. That's not just single thread either. This is an all-thread load. Now we're getting into power testing, which is one of the most interesting aspects for the X3D CPUs because they're very efficient. So for power testing, we have two primary charts. One is power efficiency, one is power consumption and all-core workload. For power
maybe to you because numbers change because you're a benchmarker.
Draw, and we use that to get an accurate number for the wattage that the CPU is using. For efficiency, what we're looking at is the amount of energy required to complete a known amount of work. So let's look
I swear to God, these guys
Here
literally
we go
just...
then. All-core, 100% power consumption.
These guys are just copying Tech Report's methodology from like a decade ago, which is their efficiency testing, where they believe that it's based on a joule per work unit. Yeah, I mean, it's eventually the way you have to go anyways, but...
100X3D at 86 watts when measured directly at the EPS 12-volt cables. It's about the same power consumption as the efficiency-tuned non-X R5 7600
We're going to skip past
and
power
R9
efficiency,
7900, which is great positioning. Now we're getting to the frame time charts. We're experimenting with publishing more of these in our reviews because it's the most empirical.
Tech Report did this too 15 years ago. Very weird. Like I said, I swear to God, these guys are just going through Tech Report and just basically picking up like the good, which I'm not necessarily against. They kind of, we went through like a dearth of good hardware review. Tech Report was I mean, it wasn't really like an Antec or Tom's Hardware as far as like popularity goes, but they put out some really good shit and some stuff that really changed kind of the industry and how stuff was tested, including frame time analysis. Yeah. But, yeah.
Empirical, purest look at the frame-to-frame data that you can get. But the problem is frame time charts are not clean. You can't get a lot of bars on them. You can't get a lot of comparisons on them. Once you're past two devices, it gets kind of hard to interpret and read them, and the lines obscure each other. So for this, we have just two CPUs, the 13.7 and the 78X3D, and then we have everything else in the rate charts as usual. But let us know what you think about this because we are adding the extra data. If people don't care, that's fine.
But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they don't need to make more benchmarks. So this is just not repurposing, but looking at the data and just making a new chart with it. So they add content without actually doing more work. I mean, it's technically work because they have to make slides and they have to add the slides and talk about them, right? But at the same time, they aren't testing more games.
Charts, but this gives you a little bit more info. So first of all, some quick education here. Frame times are simply put the metric that is used to derive the frame rate. You turn the time into a rate. It's pretty simple math. But the reason frame times are...
A better way of describing it is over seconds. So FPS is frames per second, not each frame individually. So when you're talking about the number of frames in a second, you can have multiple frames in a second, which makes it not an absolute number, right? Because each frame takes a certain amount of time to draw, and you can have a lot of them that happen in a second, which is why you end up with 400 frames in a second, but does not show you the differentiation between those frames in a second. It's almost like the number is averaged. I guess you could say it is averaged over the course of a second.
Is because frame rates and averages, even 1% lows and 0.1% lows, which are averages, those start to blur over any massive excursions or minor problems if they're not sufficient to change the average itself in a way that triggers the technician to check that data more closely. Now, normally that's fine because for us, when we see numbers that look out of place, we check more closely, we give you these charts. But now
Also,
we
why
wanna present
0.1%
them,
is very, very
more
important,
frequently.
and 1%
So
is
what we're
important
gonna be looking at
because
is
they
the
start showing you the
y-axis
weird
is
nuances in
milliseconds
the
required to
graph.
render
Average
or
does not
present
show
a
you
frame
that.
to the screen,
It can, and really
and
bad,
excursions
but
greater
when it's
than
really
8
bad, but most of the
milliseconds
time it does
tend to
not.
become noticeable, but
It's also why
primarily
0.1%
if
is
they
still
are
very
frequent in
important.
occurrence, whereas excursions that are significant, let's say 150 milliseconds or especially 500 milliseconds, half a second, one of those is
Which
noticeable
is
as like a
spiking.
hitch or a stutter. So that's what you're gonna be looking at, and these will be just head-to-head. Let's get started. Here's the CSGO frame time plot at 1080p. The 13700K plots between 2 to 4 milliseconds on average, which is ridiculous, with 2 spikes to around 10 milliseconds and a few other minor spikes. None of these are frequent or large enough to be noticeable. You need more frequent 8 millisecond plus deviations or much larger excursions. The frame-to-frame experience is consistent here. The same goes when we add the 7800X3D to the plot. This runs almost exactly the same intervals, although with marginally wider ranges top to bottom against the average. The
Variance.
spikes are similar in count,
Or
and
standard
the
deviation,
difference
depending on how you
between
want to look
peaks
at it.
is within
Which is also
reasonable
important, which almost no one
run-to-run
uses in the
variation on
graphs.
two CPUs, so they're about the same. With Cyberpunk, the 13700K fluctuated below 8 milliseconds on average.
You could
The
also
load is
use,
easier for the
what are they
CPU
called?
earlier in the
Error
test,
bars?
with
No, not error
difficulty
bars.
ramping towards the
Deviation
end.
bars.
Only 2 massive spikes appear, and one breaks the chart bounds. The worst of these two lands at 42 milliseconds, which is enough of a swing to be briefly noticeable as a stutter, maybe. Depends on what you're doing in the game. When plotting the 7800X3D, we noticed frequent excursions from the mean. The frame times regularly jumped about 4 milliseconds over the prior frame, but a 4 millisecond delta itself isn't particularly bad, and this isn't as bad as micro stutter. But the consistency with which it happens indicates an issue, and not just some one-off spike. Despite this, the CPU remains more than playable. The X3D spikes at the same spot as the 13700K did at the end, with the timing lining up on further inspection with a scene change in the game. The X3D spiked to 60 milliseconds here versus 42 on the other, but it happens on both, so this effectively nullifies it in a comparison because it's a game loading scene change. In Far Cry 6, the overall frame-to-frame consistency is excellent on both CPUs. The 13700K is slower in frame rate and hits a snag of several spikes around frame 700. The X3D is technically faster in frame rate, but has its own occasional spikes in frame time. The spikes experienced on both of these CPUs are a normal part of gaming. They aren't anomalous, unplayable, or anything we'd characterize as weird. It's just software, and both are fine, despite their unique behaviors. The X3D is advantaged here over the 13700K. That's something we know about Far Cry with Vcache. So now we're moving to the rate comparison, so average FPS 1% and 0.1% lows. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is up first. This shows greater response for X3D CPUs. The 7800X3D positions itself in second, just behind the freshly retested 7950X3D. At 386 FPS average, the 7800X3D leads the still good 5800X3D by 16%. The 13900K by a massive 27%, while being about $100 cheaper, and the 13700K by 36%, although the 7800X3D costs 5 to 14% more than the 13700K, depending on pricing at the time this goes up. That's far better scaling than the 1% FPS for 1% more money scale that we seem to be stuck on for the GPU market. So, at least in CPU land, it's still somewhat sane. The X3D CPUs have established their own cluster at the top of this chart, demonstrating that, as we've said before, it works great when games can make use of it.
It will be interesting to see what the Intel does if they start adding a lot more
the
cache to their
GPU
CPUs. I think
the
they
maximum
could be
performance for
really
all
fucking
CPUs,
good too.
expectedly,
It's kind of like
but
a
the
hat
X3D
trick
chips still
or
punch above everything else on the chart. Testing Counter-Strike Go at 1080p, the R7 7800X3D landed at 407
one trick
FPS
pony
average,
that AMD
with
has right now.
lows paced proportionally at 291 and 220 FPS. This is slightly better than the 7950X3D that we just retested, and the lows are significantly better than the preferred frequency test that we ran on the 7950X3D previously. The direct 13700K competitor manages to outperform AMD's 7800X3D in average FPS marginally, 1.6% here, with 1% lows the same and 0.1% lows worthy of further inspection, but we did that in our frame time chart earlier. More importantly, the 7700X outperforms the 7800X3D here. That was true of the 7950X outperforming the 7950X3D as well. The extra Vcache just isn't helping the 7800X3D in this title. That's fine. They don't always use every feature, and in this case, CSGO just cares more about the frequency and kind of the cores than it does that extra cache. CSGO at
Well, I mean,
1440p
I don't think
is
most
fun.
games are actually trying to use the cache. It just happens that they do, which is the case with the 5775 8 years ago, I think, 7 years ago. Whenever that came out, 6 years ago? 6 years ago? Yeah. Which was a level 4 cache on... A big level 4 cache on, like, the 4000 series or 7000 series CPUs. It was a weird in between. I mean, 5000 was a series, but it was kind of like for laptops. Very weird CPU. And I didn't have enough time, or I didn't have enough money to buy it. Tech Report did a review on that and noticed that very weird. And it was made specifically to make the Intel embedded graphics faster, but it actually could be used by the CPU too, and it actually worked pretty well.
Functionally the same. It's CPU bound, so the results don't change. We'll breeze past this chart. Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker is CPU bound, so the
So 950 X3D actually performed really poorly here. Makes you wonder if the cache is not being utilized properly. This can be seen there. Look at the 0.1% on the 7150 X3D. It's really poor. A lot of the chips have really poor 0.1%.
results don't change.
Except for the 79,
Final Fantasy
7800
XIV Endwalker
X3D.
is next, tested with the built-in benchmark to avoid the huge variable presented by connecting to the network. The 7800 X3D ran at 252 FPS average with the lows spaced, as we'd expect, for AMD CPUs at 137 and 106 FPS average for 1% and 0.1% lows. The 13600K maintains better lows and has a tied average to the 7800 X3D, making the 7800 X3D worse value than Intel's $300 i5 CPU. This 7950 X3D and 7900 X3D offer no meaningful change from the new 7800 X3D. Maybe that's part of why AMD delayed the launch on this one. 1440p is largely the same.
No one tested partially bloated Windows, guys. Partially loaded Windows.
1440p with a 4090 would still benefit
all
from
the
same
shit I
CPUs
have going
as
on
the
here.
1080p performance
Yeah.
we plotted.
Which,
Far
I
Cry
mean, I don't
6
even
is
expect
another
most
game
people to
that
have this
performs
much stuff open, but I
particularly
don't even have
well
Discord
for
open,
EV
for
cache.
instance.
The 7800 X3D
Where
is our new
things will
chart
use
topper
certain
at
parts of
2.4
my,
FPS
you know, if you have a
average,
64
leading the
processor,
7950 X3D by
they'll use
12%
different parts of your
and with lows
processor
about
while
the
you can do
same.
things like play
The
games.
lead over the
I think there's a
1300K
lot of
is
people that
similar,
watch a video in the
with a
background
20% lead over the directly
while
competing
playing a game.
i7 13700K.
Which
That's
is
a good
something.
showing from AMD's newest part
I do.
here. The 13600K
I don't do it on my main
is good
PC, I do it on my
overall value,
laptop, though,
at
just
a
to make
relatively
sure,
high
but-
end, tying the 5800 X3D in performance. But the 7800 X3D takes away all the high-end dominance from all the other parts. Performance at 1440p is about the same, with some loss off the very top end of the score. The 7800 X3D maintains its leading position here overall. In Cyberpunk 2077, the 7800 X3D ran at 260 FPS average, with the lows at 118 and 79. That has it about equal to the 7900 X3D, which is not good for the 7900 X3D, that is, but it's behind the 13700K in frame time consistency. The averages are the same, but as we saw in our earlier frame time plot, the 13700K maintains an advantage in this specific title. The 7950
Like I said, I wonder if
pushes
that has to do
slightly
with the
higher
weird
a
bug,
frequency
CPU
advantage.
bug we saw this from
F1
Gamer's Nexus
2022
too.
is next, tested at 1080p high. The 7800 X3D ran at 508 FPS average here, allowing the 7950 X3D a lead of 1%. It's massive, definitely worth hundreds of dollars. The 7800 X3D, that was sarcasm before somebody goes and buys it. The 7800
Depends on what you're doing in the background.
X3D leads the 7900 X3D once again, thanks to
I don't even
score
know if you did
advantage
stuff in the
when
background, if it would
Compared to
balance
the
the threads up properly,
3900K,
or if,
the
like, they
7800
use
X3D
core
holds an
parking,
11%
if the
lead in
game wouldn't
average
trickle
FPS,
over to
with
the other
lows
cores,
also
though.
improved.
So,
The
frequency cores.
13700K gives us a 17% lead to the 7800 X3D, which again leads in lows, as seen in the frame time plots. This is another scenario where the X3D CPUs actually seem to be doing something. The game can leverage it, but it's a scenario that makes the 7900 X3D look like a total waste in comparison to the new 78 X3D. Kind of makes sense why AMD delayed this one now. In Total War Warhammer 3, the 7800 X3D pushed to 311
Like, even with my
FPS
7950,
average
like,
and
I don't
functionally
actually
tied
want
the
to send it back to get
13700K
a 7800 X3D.
That's not
Only
great,
reason I didn't
considering
purchase
the
it and I didn't wait.
13700K is cheaper, but it could be enough to hold the line when considering the full picture of other games. We'll talk about that at the end. The 7800 X3D outmatches the 7900 X3D once again, further driving the nail into that coffin for gaming for the 7900 X3D. The 13600K remains the fiercest fighter against all these expensive CPUs and still offers some of the best overall high-end value, so it would be worth considering giving up 10 FPS for big savings that can be diverted to GPUs or memory instead. Now we're getting into production testing. This is workstation applications, content creation applications, things like that. This is where the value will start to degrade because historically, the additional cache does not benefit these CPUs in the applications we test for production as much as, say, more cores or frequency would. Blender cycles rendering is first. This uses a tile-based renderer
pretty
where
far up
one
there.
tile is spawned per thread.
16
Even with
E-cores
all
on it,
16
which
threads
actually
running,
they aren't that horrible. They're like 4 generations
here.
old.
The 7700X
Like 7000
outperforms
series,
it,
I think, is what they're
benefiting
equivalent
from
of.
the higher
But
frequency
there's 16
more
of them,
than the cache.
in addition to
The
8 cores.
13600K also embarrasses the 7800X 3D for the price, using its 6 P cores and 8 E cores, totaling 12 threads with hyperthreading to land a 10.7-minute render time. That's a reduction of 16% against the 7800X 3D. It's not a good start for AMD on production value. It can do it, but you really need to be buying it as a gaming-first CPU that can handle this type of work as a secondary. When compiling the Chromium codebase, the 7800X 3D required 67 minutes to complete the compile, getting beaten once again by the 64-minute result of the 7700X. The 13600K has a 19% lead, driving the dagger in for AMD's X3D in this type of workload. In file compression benchmarking, ranked in millions of instructions per second, the 7800X 3D once again falls behind. It completes 118,000 MIPS here, allowing the 7700X a lead at technically 122,000 MIPS, and the 13600K a lead at 132,000 MIPS. The comparably priced 13700K, meanwhile, is 35% ahead with a 159,000 MIPS score. Decompression has the 7800X 3D at 135. 100X 3D with our Liquid Freezer 2360 attached ran at also a lower frequency ceiling to protect the 7950. So the 7800X 3D is extremely efficient. This follows on the same path AMD was setting with its other X3D CPUs, not necessarily with the initial 7000 launch, but they got there with eco mode. So it is very efficient in at least all core workloads. That's a good thing. For gaming, we did see uplift, and it was meaningful when the 3D cache works, and it doesn't work in every game. We've talked about this a lot already. Not going to cover when and why it works.
So for an end user, what you're supposed to do if the game is not working properly, I don't know how you're supposed to figure out if the game's not working properly unless you know how to diagnose things. But as an end user, if the game is not working properly, you're supposed to go into the Windows game bar and turn on game mode. And that's supposed to automatically flag the program and put it onto the proper cores. That's how you're supposed to do it as an end user. But first, the end user has to figure out that the game's not functioning properly to do that. And most end users are not going to be able to do that, right? Which generally involves you just looking at a bunch of cores. That being said, you also need to figure out whether or not it performs better on frequency or cache cores, which is also something an end user, and even I, would have problems doing because I'd have to benchmark games and flip back and forth between the two, which would be an involved process because everything's running on my frequency cores now. So, yeah, I guess basically my scenario is I'm just going to put everything on the cache cores and pray. I'm going to pray. Yeah.
Actually good, and it does make the CPU strongly worth considering. We'll go over more of that in a second. This is a total waste in production first use cases. So if you are not gaming as a primary use for your computer, you should buy something else. It's really as simple as a 7950X or 13900K, 13700K, 13th gen, seriously worth considering for something like
especially
a desktop
13700
class computer you use for.
Let's say 13700 from majority users.
Compiling, compression, decompression, maybe, but AMD's more competitive there, especially in decompression. Either way, this CPU does not make sense for those use cases because you're spending the money on something that those applications can't use.
$8 grand.
Spend that same money on a more powerful CPU for those applications. But for gaming, it's worth talking about. And then the last major point before we get to the details is this, as we said earlier, makes the 7900X 3D look absolutely terrible as any kind of value for gaming. And it's for easy reasons. We already explained them. So this basically pretend the 79X 3D doesn't exist. This invalidates it. And we had a feeling it was going that direction when 79X 3D doesn't exist. We already explained them. So this basically pretend the 79X 3D doesn't exist. This invalidates
700 or 7950?
This basically pretend the 79X.
Cut it off. 79X. There's no 50 or 100 in there.
3D doesn't exist. This invalidates it. And we had a feeling it was going that direction when we reviewed the 79X3D a month or whatever ago it was. It's been a long time
Keeps cutting
now,
it off.
that those
7900X 3D for sure. 7950X 3D, I think there is a usage case there in which you have stuff running in the background which no one's testing, which I went around to a bunch of different outlets and suggested they test when the X3D chips are coming out, mainly to see how the hodgepodge duct tape together thread scheduler / core parking / game bar bullshit would work with that. And no one tested it back then. And I even made those comments prior to the benchmark coming out, mind you. No one tested it, still not testing it. And there's a case where you could actually, P and E cores would also benefit from this, right? Because you put the workload onto E cores, but apparently some E cores have problems with you overloading clusters because the E cores come in clusters, like the 7900. Excuse me, the that's 13900K has 16 E cores in it, but they come in 4 clusters. So there's basically 4 chiplets in there in the clusters, and each of the clusters share resources with each other. So it can actually potentially make things worse too.
So, going over the details. The reason it looks terrible is because it's getting beaten in scenarios where the 8 cores on this are better than the effective 6 cores on the 79 when you're parking the cores.
Keep saying 7900 because there's a 7950 too. Maybe he's just shortening the 7900, but not the 7950.
All you're giving up there is between the two CPUs is maybe a workstation advantage, definitely in the 79X3D, but for other reasons already mentioned, it's irrelevant. Secondly, the 7800X3D for gaming, occasionally the 7700X beats it, but that's when frequency matters more than the additional cache. We showed a chart earlier demonstrating it, but the frequency is higher on the 7700X in our testing for an all-core workload, and that benefits it in games where that's what they care about. Really rapidly recapping the charts then, the biggest competitors are the 13.7 and the 13.6. In CSGO, they make more sense, but that class for performance, 13700K at the same price, roughly or cheaper, is better, assuming no other options exist than the 7800X3D. In Cyberpunk, the 13700K and 7800X3D were tied with the advantage to the 13700K for lows. In F1, there was a massive performance boost for X3D, as we've seen before, and a big gain versus the 13700K. Far Cry 6, 78X3D was a clear leader. Final Fantasy 14, the 13700K was a clear leader. So they're going back and forth here. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 78X3D was a clear leader. It's not even close. And in Total War Warhammer, it was about tied.
I'm going to give you a test this time. Let's actually take a peek at this real quick. Can we just scroll down? No ray tracing, good. 1, 2, 3. Kind of weird that they put 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They test 7 games this time. Honestly, does not feel like it's enough. Once again,
is I suppose analyzing how large is the gap when there is a gap between the CPU and to whom does the favor go. For the most part, when there's a gap, it
someone got a black light.
The
oh my god!
7800X3D. However, when the 7800X3D is not leading, the 13700K is lead. Other than in Final Fantasy, it's maybe less impressive. But overall, they do go back and forth a bit. The 13700K to us maybe makes more sense as an all-around CPU, being a little bit cheaper and also having advantages in production workloads. If you are only gaming, then the 7800X3D suddenly becomes much more worth considering. But unfortunately, there's no easy answer for, unless you play one of the games that a reviewer is testing, how much does it help you personally? Because it is very game to game.
It's just color LED.
It's clear cut. The 7800X3D is much better value than the 7900X3D. The 79 now looks like a complete and utter joke. The 7950X3D has more or less been entirely invalidated, more so maybe than previously. Previously it had that sort of, but it's technically the best that it could hold on to, but now it's not even really, it's not enough. So
if you're just playing games and you're not doing anything in the background,
you're either looking at a 78X3D from AMD for the top
partially bloated Windows install, guys.
I'll
be curious on that.
And sometimes they're worse, or the 13700K for the same price. Those are the two to narrow it down a lot. And the 13.6 remains amazing value if you want to get basically top-end CPU performance for $300 to save money for your GPU or RAM or something. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what you thought of the additional depth on the frame times. If you want us to spend review airtime on that in the future, we can add more of them or do more interesting analysis if people
Add
really
more
like
games.
It's something we did
Test
a long
more
time
games.
ago,
Oh,
but
okay.
we moved away from it because just
Already.
can't fit as much stuff on the charts, and it requires every time a little bit more audience education, because anytime you get new people in who haven't seen them before, we need to explain it, which is totally cool, and I love doing it. But
More games. Okay.
miniatures up to component repair, solder.
Okay. Let's take a look at Tech Power Up's review now, because they did a good job last time. See if they have anything of interest here. We're just going to skip through it. They have PBO Max, PBO Stock, which I guess is technically an overclock. For the 13900K, there's 7950X3D. They don't stipulate whether or not this, maybe they have it in their testing methodology, whether or not that's favoring cache cores, because they, in the last review, they'd prefer cache cores and prefer frequency. So 50X3D is way down there. We have to prefer frequency. Another one where it's probably not using the cache properly. So a couple of those guys. Yeah, like here. Like here, there's probably another one, which is Bannerlord, Mountain Blade. Another one in Spider-Man. Anytime you're seeing the 7950X3D do worse. Oh, these are ray tracing now. Yeah. These. %. X3 is looking better, but I think that once again this is because it's misassigning the cores. Power consumption, power, temperatures, overclocking and boost frequencies. Or parking fail. Yeah, so they had problems with Benchmark. They had to do a clean install to fix it. And this, I mentioned this before with like Overwatch. I can't get it to use. I have the worst core out of my 8 cores it won't use. I don't know why. In my cache cores, it won't use it. And that's not where you should be. I'm gonna wash my coffee cup real quick here, guys, and grab a soda. I'll be right back. I'll keep going. Yeah. Anyways, so I have a problem with Overwatch where it's not using 2 of my cores, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's related to this or what's going on here. So they had to fix it by reinstalling Windows. Tom's Hardware said they fixed it by, what'd they do? They didn't really fix it. They disabled core parking, I think. I already have core parking disabled. That's not what's happening with my computer, though. Here it says it's a core parking problem, too. All my cores are unparked, but it's just not using one of my CPUs for some reason. Specifically, the lowest rated CPU core. Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess, guys, basically it's summed up as, I'd actually say 7800 X3D is what I recommend most people get, but an alternative would be like a 13700 is also what I'd recommend comparably to it. But the difference between the 13700 and the 7800 X3D or the 7900 series, 7950 series, is that you don't have to fuck around with the two CCDs, which is an extra headache. So in that regard, it comes down to 13700 versus the 7800 X3D because you don't need to fuck around with stuff. I'd still recommend a 7800 X3D, which is what I was going with prior to this coming out, and I'd still think that I'd go with that. Feels different. I think it was Gamers Next said, "Oh, you're not gonna be able to tell the difference." It's not really anything to do. Maybe it's placebo, but it definitely feels different than the 13900K. And 5900X obviously felt different just because it was slower than the 13900K that I had. But at the same time, it feels different. It feels smoother, but at the same time, it feels like there's more input delay. And I don't know if the input delay is just something I have to iron out, or different things in my system that I'm just gonna have to figure out along the way. Because I still have C-states are still off because I don't want it fucking around, because C-states will add variance. I don't want to fucking around with things right now, in which I can turn on PBO when I turn on C-states, which will get even more performance. The other one is I have to tune my memory, which I haven't done yet. So there's room to wiggle things out, because right now even my KISS by default settings, X and P settings, are not supported by my motherboard, and it causes things to lock up, so they're off right now. It's just basically overclocked to 6000 megahertz, even though it's a 6400 kit, and the sub-timings are not where they should be. Interesting. Good. Definitely think 7800 X3D is what I'd recommend most people if they're going for a higher end chip. I'd say, like Hub said, it was higher end. I'd say mid to high end. It's starting to finally come down in price, but yeah. And I don't think I'd sell, like, even if I could, I wouldn't try and sell my 7950 X3D for 7800. I knew what I was getting into when I bought a 7950 X3D. That's specifically why I waited and tried to figure things out. And I think I basically copied it, but I think came up with a good solution, which is you don't even need to have the core parking feature enabled and the provisioning driver installed, and then you just do everything manually. Everything just ends up on my frequency cores unless I push it to my cache cores. It works for me. Some people might not want to go through the headache, but it's literally something I've done for years at this point, so there's no reason not to do it. That's what it comes down to. But there's still, even with doing this, guys, there's still shit on Windows. This is why the cache core should have been the second CCD. There's still stuff in Windows that will use your 0 and 1. There's some things in here that aren't even on 0 and 1, and they're still trying to use it. Why? I don't know. But here it is. Even the majority of stuff is supposed to be going to my frequency cores, it's not. Frequency should definitely have been CCD 0, excuse me, instead of 1. So it's primary, and Windows will try and use it. Unless you explicitly tell Windows to use something else. Windows doing dumb things. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm actually debating on putting it's a very involved process, guys, changing out my motherboard and everything. I'm actually thinking about going to my 13900K, putting it back in, specifically because I figured out that my power, my double conversion ups was malfunctioning. It wasn't doing things as it should be. Shame, but that's where we're at. So, yeah. Okay. All right, guys, we got to play some games tonight. Actually, gaming has been very good. I'm not going to lie. Felt very, very good this morning, guys. I was popping off, as the kids say. Let's turn this into a highlight. Make some content here after it catches up.